What I try to do is to put you in an imaginary zone of speculation, which is one of the pillars of knowledge, alongside further ones, the education, education, and all this realization that makes us understand that everything we can do is observe, is acknowledge, is let ourselves be open. And now there's a bit more of an echo chamber here, but all these makes us realize that we are part of a bigger mindset. And in that, I tried to open up to that event today, alongside my colleague Elena Gudio, and I always forget to say my name, but maybe Elena, you would like to say?
Thank you. These were, is it working, Ranaf? Yes. These were words by my, no, it's working. By Arlette, Louise and Dacose. It is working, no? Yes, it does. Thank you, Arlette, for introducing. This is my son, Eduardo, so talking about present, future. Oh no, it's true, I'm mistaken. This is Jacopo, sorry. I confused the name of my son.
The children remind us always who we are.
That's when mamas are getting completely blurred. Thank you for pointing that out. Anyway, I'm not making it long, but I want to say that we are really very, very grateful that Denise Ferreira da Silva is with us in the house, with Edna Bonhomme, so two figures that are actually representing for us a lot. We've been inviting Denise a couple of times, but she was joining us just virtually until now. She contributed to some of our publications. She was part of our hospitality project, and she's in all the readers of our the students and all the reading groups that we are doing. So it's really very present, but finally is physically present here in the space. And because Savi is a space of where we practice radical conviviality, I think it's going to be different now that you are here with us in person. And Edna also has been a great friend, also coming physically because she's in Berlin a few times and inspiring many of our thinking through sound, through text, through discussions, and many, many others. So yes, that's enough from me and my child, Jacopo.
Savvy Contemporary is a space of generations, of the ones who came before, who are and will be with us. And in that, the mindset I try to put us in is one of the forms that scholars, artists, activists, the ones who don't divide what is the realization of being, that you will manifest today as you manifest it through your beings. So in short, we will have a two-stage moment today. One stage is just taking place, and one will be downstairs after a moment of coming together and having some nutrition for the soul. In short, today, we find ourselves together through the realization of scholars in Berlin. We have invited Denise Ferreira da Silva to think alongside an actualization of your work that you are and have been realizing in different places. And now you have been for more than a week in Berlin, and you will stay all in all for 3 weeks. You have been invited by members of what is called SCRIPT, an interdisciplinary conglomeration of professors in Germany who think about social politics through the lens of the ones who critically engage in it. Liberalism as something that can enable but also refrain. In short, I would like to introduce you alongside Edna Bonhomme, who, as Elena Gudiotto has mentioned, has accompanied our work in thinking about toxicity, about what makes us ill, and how we can actually find spaces to heal. So in short, Denise Ferreira da Silva, you have just a book of you has just been published this year in February, and in August there will be the English translation. We talk about unpayable debt, which is a thinking on colonialism and the fact that raciality and racism is one factor that is still dominating the way we structure our societies. And in that, it is a question also about the sensing, about that which can connect. So you are a philosopher, and you have been director of the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Your academic writing and artistic practice address the ethical political challenges of the global present. There's this terminus about poethics, the poetics and the ethics, that think about challenging what you call the patriarch form, and also the post-enlightenment. So that, in short, we have talked about a book that will arrive. There have been many more that have been accompanying your engagement of more than 30 years. Edna Bonhomme, you are a philosopher and director of the Institute. Sorry, no, that has been not you. It could be, but you are a historian. Let's not stick to the script. Okay, so you've been a historian of science and also working interdisciplinary. As a writer, cultural writer, you earned a PhD from Princeton University, and you examine contagion, epidemics, and toxicity by asking what makes people sick. As an artist, you invite people to sit with the messiness of contagion, the discomforts of maladies, and the embodied knowledge that gives people the power to heal. So we will have today an enactment of the book by Denise Ferreira da Silva, and a response by you, Edna Bonhomme, in a frame that is called the POETHICAL READING. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everyone.
So I have to use glasses now, and I can't see you with those glasses, but you're all like funny big. So yeah, thank you so much for this amazing, lovely, animated introduction. It was absolutely perfect. And I'm really happy to finally, I think it's my first visit to SAVI ever. And now to SAVI Archives, right? Because you were both here, so. Oh yeah. And I'd like to thank the cluster of excellence beyond the liberal scripts for making this possible, for bringing me and keeping me in Berlin for 2 weeks, which is a treat, I can tell you. And then also for SAVI for hosting all of these events, including the conversation we had earlier today, which was absolutely amazing. I'm really grateful for that. So I'm going to read from this book, and you can see, oh my God, it's a funny one. I'm reading, and thank you, Edna, for playing with me this part, and all of you for being here. So I'm going to read from the book. If you read the book, you'll know where I'm reading from. If you don't, so you have heard it. First is a quote from Kindred by Octavia Butler. Yes, maybe what? Well, maybe. If I wasn't completely out of my mind, if I wasn't in the middle of the most perfect hallucination I'd ever heard of, if the child before me was real and I was telling the truth, maybe he was one of my ancestors. Maybe he was my several times great-grandfather, but still vaguely alive in the memory of my family because his daughter had brought a large Bible in an ornately carved wooden chest and had begun keeping family records in it. My uncle still had it. Grandmother Hagar Whaling, born in 1831. Hers was the first name listed, and she had given her parents' names as Rufus Whaling and Alice Green something Whaling. Rufus, what was Alice's last name? end quote. Not knowing how she arrived there might have become a second or even a third concern as Diana realized that she was deep into her family history. She knew for sure that her several times great-grandfather was her several times great-grandmother's honor. That much was given away by his name, a last name that recalled only more immediately than those of the other Black persons, other descendant from enslaved persons, that her family's origin was defined by something that differs from what most understand as familial relations. And yet there she was, talking to, seeing, touching her ancestor honor. There she was, his life in her hands, knowing that she could not take for granted the fact that if he had hers in his hands, it would not render that world any less dangerous to her than had she not descended from him. Knowing Alice's last name might verify her experiences, establish it as something that was indeed happening. Knowing Alice's last name might confirm or reject it as a reality that, though not the hallucination she conjectures, would, as if it turned out, be equally improbable. Would confirming Alice's last name make much of a difference? Would it render meeting her honor ancestor less improbable? Probably not. However, it would not make it something beyond the realm of possibility. After all, there was the Bible. Oh, I'm killing the book. The Bible and the last name. Perhaps other memories and mementos were hidden in someone's closet somewhere. More importantly, in a way, she has always been there as Alice's possible offspring's possible daughter. Still, she's not there as Alice's several times great-granddaughter. That could never be the answer to a question about where she came from or who she was. From the point of view of that world, it was impossible. Alice did not have children. She was barely no longer one. From the point of view of Dana's world, it was improbable, but also incomprehensible, because if she were to try to answer the question of who she was, she would have to answer it in a way that did not belie the fact that she had never been enslaved. And yet, even if she could try, as she did, she would find that it does not matter. Then there, that she was not or had not been anyone's property. Existing as a Black woman in antebellum Maryland was not safe, as she found out more than once. The truth that was a unmistakable aspect of that reality in which that boy, her several times great-grandfather, needed her to remain alive, and her several times great-grandmother was still childless. That truth made it all the more important and yet useless to know whether she was hallucinating or indeed then there. Can't see anything. Nothing she had book learned about it, how it was back then, had prepared her for the kind of life learning she was to get while then there. The first time on the river she was sure Rufus' mother would have killed her, or had her killed had she not fainted. Then I was saving her 5-year-old son from drowning would not have made any difference. Then I was a Black woman and therefore a slave. She was not one of the whaling slaves, so she must be a runaway. Nothing but a runaway, and as such intrinsically dangerous to slavery as an institution and to the white folk. A nobody to the farms, Black folk, nothing to them, and also someone they would not know where to place. a black person from a different space-time moment, from there then where black folks write, and do not exist under the threat of the whip or worse. There was nothing that she could do to control how much others would know about her. And she did try. Every now and then someone caught a contradiction, an untoward gesture, a sign that she did not understand what was expected from her as a slave. And it was as a slave that she had to fulfill her charge, to prevent her honor ancestor's death, so she herself would come to life, to exist. Among many things that Dana, as someone living in 1976 Los Angeles, did and could know about antebellum Maryland, was the fact that her skin color rendered her a captive. This was not a matter of personal identification, though she did exist like the other black persons on the whaling plantation, both enslaved and free. Back then, what mattered was not her first-person approach to that world, but that in that world, the colonial political architecture of where slavery was the main economic modality. There she occupied a third-person position, but one referred to as a she or a he that has the juridical status of an it, that is, of property. The association of skin color and property status was such that even if she had papers proving her to be a free black person, it did not guarantee that she would not have to exist as a slave. How could it possibly make sense? Why would a young black woman be sent there then to save the life of a white male child? An impossible task. Someone who then there was always to fear for life and limb could not have the power to protect the white child of a slave owner. Whether or not she belonged there, regardless of whether she was indeed there then, Dana was certain and would be reminded over and over again that her position in that world, Rufus and Alice's world, was not so much precarious as it was fully and well-defined. Whether or not she had papers, or Rufus' fathers had papers showing his ownership of her, his claim of title of her, she was a whaling slave. That she was also a member of the family is one of those possible and probable things that do not receive much attention nowadays. Neither the biological blood nor the juridical title ties owners and slaves back then there are given much import, though she and her husband, Kevin, knew that such relationships, filial, blood, or juridical marriage, in their day, nowadays, were not accepted by all. They also knew that this is not because white persons were once owners and black persons, their slaves. The explanation is that white and black persons do not match. There are too many differences, too much history. Interracial, filial, and romantic relationships, especially in the mid-70s, done as here now, were met with suspicion at best. Who is to say, then I could concede, that just as Whaling's Bible had remained in the black family, the white Whalings did not inherit a share of the black bodies that were expended in the cultivation of their ancestors' farmlands. For that is just as possible as Dana being back then there, wondering if she is saving the life of her honor ancestor. Before she learns Alice's last name, the question of what was happening, of her experience, what was happening to her, would remain undetermined at the level of reality, but not at the level of truth, because Dana's several times great-grandfather could have been a slave owner. It was probable. And knowing Alice's last name would ascertain, if that was true, that Rufus was indeed him. Because when Dana was born, Rufus and not Alice had been dead for decades, it is not possible that that person in front of her, Rufus, was indeed him. Nonetheless, since Rufus is her honor ancestor and she was saving his life, irrespective of whether the experience was possible or real, whether it was possible for her to be really spatio-temporally present in 1830s Maryland and not having a dream or a hallucination, Dennis' charge, although incomprehensible, is thinkable.
So first of all, thank you, Savvy, for hosting this event, and for the audience for attending, and thank you so much, Denise, for reading such a rich portion of your latest book, especially since it's giving us this opportunity to think deeply about the intersections of science fiction and the works of Octavia Butler, not just as a kind of imaginative piece of literature, but also in how it ties quite deeply to history. And as a historian of science, as someone who's engaging in the works of the archives, especially in the context of thinking actively about plantations, prisons, and other spaces that have also been the site of contagion, more specifically the Harriet Jacobs' autobiography of a slave girl has been quite informative for me in thinking about how the plantation has been not just a site of violence through forced labor, but even in the context that you're describing, the family as also the site of violence, especially as white male plantation owners would often enact sexual violence on Black women on the plantation. And I wanted to kind of engage with that, that aspect of your work, the extent to which the family as a juridical category, as a concept, especially if we think about how the family and even reproduction is being contested in the US right now, plays a role in how we can think more broadly about speculation, fiction, and perhaps even maybe even deconstructing the family as a whole.
Hello? Yeah, it's back. Something happened. Well, I was about to say that's a nice way of beginning a conversation about how to counter family values' latest blow on us, right? But okay, so what I do, maybe it's not just fortunate that kindred is about familial ties, right? It's about blood ties. And it's not just fortunate because we know the significance of blood in the US and to the way in which racial subjugation is plotted in the US, both historically, but also geographically, with the distinctions between the South and the North, and in the ways in which the two geographic parts of the country are tied to the US self-conception, which also means the ways in which that racial plot, which is tied to and explained and defined, determined through bloodlines, at least in the US national discourse, the ways it became tied to the history of the planet, to the global context in the past 100 and many years or so. So thinking along those lines and thinking, on the other hand, how slavery could not, especially in the US, slavery would not have survived without those blood connections, but not through the familial, right? Because different than Brazil, where there was a large, significant number of slaves bought and brought from the continent, the US, there was a reproduction of the very labor force. That putting all those pieces together, I think that we can not only, like a critique of which is what I do, it's more on the other side. I do a critique of slavery, but it's also a critique of state capital that begins with slavery as the primary juridic economic institution, the primary juridic economic institution under a modality of governance that it's possible and possibilitate the expropriation of indigenous land. We can from there unleash a challenge to all the other institutions, be that the family or be that the church itself, that also never seem to have had much, actually, in some places like Brazil, participate in slavery, in another place like the US, in the post-slavery period also was defined by that racial plot, was at least in terms of segregation. So my answer for your question is yes. If we take the connection, not the connection to blood on the one hand, and then the ethical dimensions of that plot into account, but also assume that of those institutions, they took a particular tonality in state capital in the past 150 years or so, right? We can, and that I think would give us some ammunition to deal with this attack, because several things will become distinct. For instance, the political figure that is represented by, the U.S. Supreme Court justices or any other figuring of the political subject. It would no longer be, let's talk about the liberal script again, would no longer be the abstract individual property owner, right? We would also already begin with that person being a cis male father of the white children and the legitimate slaves that would work in their farms, and everything else would come with it. So in that way, yes, right? I mean, we can unleash a critique of the institution through a representation, reformulation of the central figure in all of those institutions, which is, it's given by looking at slavery in such a way. But told you, I can take forever with the question. We had a conversation, I was like, we can have one question or 10, it depends on how long I'll take with it.
Well, I can sit here and listen to you speak all day, so I don't mind. But one of the things that I also found very compelling about your book, Unpayable Debt, is the ways that you try to engage with how raciality gets realized, and you do so not just in the context of thinking about racial capitalism, which you're alluding to, that at the very basis of not just the United States, but also Brazil, Haiti, where my family's from, Central America, Colombia, Peru, so many of these different countries relied on, one, the expropriation of indigenous land and genocide, but two, the mass displacement and free labor of people of African descent. And what that creates is, as Ami Césaire speaks of, the thingification of people of African descent through these very violent measures. And in thinking about that and how, not just what Césaire has written about, but also Achille Mbembe, there's a huge literature now kind of thinking within Black studies where people are engaging with the human. So you cite Sylvia Wynter, you cite Hortense Spiller, amongst others, and there's also a newer generation of scholars like Zakia Iman Jackson, who's written a book on becoming human. And one thing I want you to talk about is this generational shift from someone like Ami Césaire, who's thinking actively about what he referred to as thingification, the work that you're doing in engaging with Black feminists, and this new wave of literature that's also kind of pushing the ideas or critiquing posthumanism, and how that then relates to the work of speculation.
I missed the question about speculation. No problem. I will. It's funny. I was thinking about saying, as you were talking about Césaire, and then so that is Césaire and Wynter, and Zykia and others, and the critique of the human. Which is kind of beautiful in that in this book, one of the things, the ways in which I'm describing the slave, the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation is that she is both a human and a thing. And for me, it gives away it locates me generationally, because I think in the passage from a critique, from racial and anti-colonial critique, from a kind of racial and anti-colonial critique that was still invested in some kind of better human. Oh my God, is it my dog? It sounds like my Zaka. It's like, what do you mean human? That actually was a critique of the dehumanization. We should do it, right? But I think in more sophisticated ways back for maybe most of the 20th century. The racial and colonial critique, even though it wasn't a celebration, was a celebration of European and the European rendering of the human, but it was still a call for being included in the human family. And I think that also was connected to an emphasis on the juridic economic dimensions of colonial and neo-colonial and imperial domination and of racial subjugation. Now, as we talk now, we had the whole of the 1990s, like kind of immediately after the announcement of globalization, in the whole of the 1990s, there was all this emphasis on human rights. And like conference after conference, we end up discussing how all of those human rights instruments were just failing because that human did not involve everyone, right? And I think that was, and I remember because I was studying and I was writing about this thing back then, there was something that could combine with the critique of state capital in a way that would, that might have had an effect had it not been the fact that, if not probably all of those human rights instruments end up being deployed in the global context and being used as a weapon against former colonial holdings of Europe. So the going towards post-humanism was kind of like a missed. Something was missed in that, and I think precisely because let me say, I think it was coherent. It made sense in that context because that shift in the 1990s was a shift to the ethical, right? So the critique of the human is a critique that takes place in that ethical moment, but people just forgot that, that ethical doesn't come alone. It comes along with the juridic and economic. So the new, Sylvia Winter, like the piece that everybody talks about, like, of hers was that from 1992, the one about humans, no humans involved, right? Was about a shooting. So it's already in that moment, and I think it took a while for us to start actually advancing critiques of the human, which were not the post-humanists, right? Because what Zykia and Winter are doing is not the post-humanist one. It's like taking back that potential. And for me, I think these, describing the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation as a human and a thing, and that being something, that not being a choice. Actually, I take the side of the thing. I couldn't care less about the human, right? We go to the thing at the end of the book, if you're wondering. The thing is what we're going for. But it's, yeah, so I think what, then I can talk about the speculation, because what the speculation allows us to do is really to move the conversation, to go through, obviously, and especially with Judith, wow, Octavia Butler. It allows us to go through what the steps of critique, right? you know, and in the kind of critique that I've been doing is a critical legal theory kind of thing, so the juridic, economic, etc., and also the ethical, but also shift the issue around and ask other questions that go beyond it, and take also the ethical consideration beyond the limits of modern thinking, which is, you know, the choice between the human and the thing is still within that limit. Reconfiguring the human so as to make it less European also, I don't think it's going to do much. Reconfiguring everything else to make everything else more human is going to be a disaster, as it's being all the time. But the philosophical basis for our thinking, those are the options they give. Those are the options we have. So with what sci-fi allows us to do is to, like, you know, take off in some other way. While it still, you know, it still makes sense, right? It's still the same grammar. It's not a totally revolutionary way of describing things, but, you know, you can go somewhere else. And then you speculate. Then critique becomes one moment, and then speculation is another one. Becomes, again, something to be done, you know, for fun or because one has a project. Mostly for fun.
So one of the identities that I have is that I'm a recovering scientist. So as a former nerd, I would work in a lab and pipette and experiment specifically on muscular dystrophy and multiple sclerosis. But the reason I bring that up is because within the text that you wrote, science as a theme, as a kind of super force, kind of enters in when we think about how scientific authority has at times used itself or used the principles of science to engage in biological determinism with respect to race, with respect to creating racial hierarchies of sorts. And this is, as you know, something that has been present in the Enlightenment context with specific biologists such as Linnaeus and Blumenbach here in Germany, constructing taxonomies of human life and thereby putting meaning on those living beings. And part of what some Black theorists have been trying to do is not to reify these very limited, superficial, and destructive notions of science that deny us of our whatever, if you want to call it humanity, if you want to call it something else, but our presence, our being, but to maybe engage with science in a playful way and perhaps a speculative way. And one particular work that I'm thinking about that allowed me to reconceptualize science, and we talked about this a little bit, is Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science, where she, as a Black feminist, is trying to see how can we use curiosity and experimentation as an avenue for Black studies, and as an avenue for Black liberation, perhaps, and also as an avenue for failing when within the sciences and being okay with that. And I wonder, have you, in your work as a philosopher, engaged with that playfulness of curiosity in science studies?
No, I wrote a really boring, difficult book to get the science out of my system. And in order to get the science out of my system, I had to go back through, you know, the history of modern philosophy, and until I found, you know, the deployment of raciality in the 19th, 20th century to be a fundamental moment in the whole resolution of the philosophical problem that animated Western thought for 400 years. So I don't find anything playful in the science part of it. But I do find a lot playful in the math part of it. I like to play with math. And I don't like to play, also I was trained as a social scientist, so I really have good reasons for not finding it fun. But, but I like the math part of it, and I do so because, so the thing with scientific knowledge, and it doesn't matter that quantum physics, which I love, right? So I was kind of lying a little bit, but I'll say why I love it so much. Doesn't matter, even in quantum physics, that, you know, the thing that they are studying absolutely failed their basic metaphysical assumption of space-time, right? Whether it's Newton's or Einstein, doesn't matter. They will, all the measurements and all the theories assume it's something that is in space-time, that moves, that's separate from other things, and then the things end up always failing to do so. So basically, scientific thought has this, what I call formal efficacy, these two descriptors. So formal in the sense that there is this level of abstraction and separation at the mental level, but it also corresponds to abstraction and separation at the space-time level. And efficacy, which is the efficient cause, right? That is, you're studying the cause for the effects. And that's where, you know, quantum particle physics, the experimental part of it, fails. And that makes it interesting. Now, math, I like math because it's formal. That is the efficacy is there in the algorithms, which is something else we can talk later. It has a formal efficacy, the algorithms that rule our lives. But when you're just working with the equation is formal, but it also has a form. It has some pieces that you can move. You know, you can identify them, you can name the object you produce, and then you can move it around in order to make the statement that you'd like to do. So that's the playfulness that I like. But that is kind of also, I do so by violating what you're supposed to do with an equation, as some scientists told me at UBC not long ago, that I was part of an interdisciplinary group. And then I talked about my work, and I gave as an example the equation of value. And there was a biologist, a physicist, a chemist, and a psychologist, a proper psychologist, number cruncher. And I showed it, and it's like, you can't do it. I said, I can, I'm doing it. But you can't do it. It's like, it's wrong? No, but you can't do it. And I said, yes, I know, but I can. Because it's also, that is the sacred thing, but it is a form. In both, it is formal and it's also form with the pieces. But the way I find it playful is in by violating it. In the same way, and I'm attracted by particle physics and condensed matter physics precisely because the things they work on also fail or violate some of what is expected. But the other science, the normal science of our lives, no.
Well, I would highly recommend that you read Shonda Prescott Weinstein's The Disordered Cognitive. Because she, as you know, is doing excellent work as a Black physicist and Black feminist as well. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is kind of the title of your book and what it suggests and how you open up your book and the 2017 essay that this was based off of. Because in a way, it's not just in the realm of cultural production that you're thinking actively about debt. You're also engaged with and trying to unpack and excavate how debt was also something at the center of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and the ways in which particularly Black and Latinx people were blamed for a major financial crisis that was ultimately created by banks who dictated these subprime loans, and in many cases, many of those people, especially the executives at the top of these financial regimes, they didn't go to jail. They weren't vilified to the same extent outside of, obviously Occupy, pointing them out.
They were too big to fail, too rich to fail.
Exactly, and they were bailed out ultimately in 2008. And part of what you try to do and flesh out in this text is to not just say, well, why are these people of color being blamed for a major financial structure that they didn't create, but rather the entire financial system as it's designed is set up for them to fail. In fact, it's set up for any debt that is incurred to be unpayable. And to that to that remark, I think your text offers such insight for us to really make a case, actually, an anti-capitalist case, that under capitalism, Black and brown people on a whole, if we think on a global scale and if we think about racial capitalism, the system isn't designed for people to be able to get themselves out of this major indebted situation. And I wanted to kind of ask, like, why did that become a prime example for you to try to unpack raciality and capitalism?
Toward the global idea of race was supposed to be something, and then it ended up advancing, among other things, the argument that racial subjugation, raciality, so also racial difference and cultural difference, they map the global space, right? They constitute globality as an ontological horizon and very much establish that which belongs to what is the region of that proper human, and then, and those who do so, in the places that do so, they show that they actualize the principles of liberty, equality, but primarily prosperity, and raciality as a non-epistemological descriptor also account for why the ones who are not white Europeans or former colonizers, why they do not share in liberty, equality, and prosperity. But the social scientific explanations for that always resolve that reason back on racial difference or cultural difference, right? And never located in the larger juridic economic context that brought the situation into being. So when Paula and I were working on that special issue, we were, one thing we wanted to do, and number one, of course, we wanted to get this special issue on American Quarterly. Number two, we want to talk to the Americans and try to explain to them that racial subjugation matters in other places and not only in the ways that it matters in the US, and that the global economic crisis of 2007-2008 wasn't an exception, but was part of a longer trajectory of economic crisis, which were not called global because they didn't impact everyone in the same way, but they impacted Russia and the former tigers, and they impacted Brazil and Latin America. So what we did was, okay, so we can take the argument toward the global idea of race, right? And then look at the ways in how racial subjugation is taking place in this accounting for this economic crisis, in a way that allows us to connect what's happening to black and immigrant folks in the US to black folks elsewhere in other places, whether it is black folks in Brazil, black folks in the UK, or black folks in Senegal or in South Africa, right? Like just taking, but thinking of blackness as skin color, right? Not calling everybody black in the ways in which we understand blackness, but just blackness as a skin color and as an indicator of a particular kind of social subjugation. But behind this is also like this, it's an attempt, I mean, the larger argument is that there isn't such a thing as racial capitalism. There is no capitalism without coloniality and raciality. It's one and the same thing, right? There is no special part of capitalism. And hence, we can, all the claims that we make, all the demands for justice, whether they are presented in terms of our participation in different moments of our social conditions, or in terms of restoration of not only what was lost, taken away, but what could have being had it not happened, hence the future perfect. So all those demands are fundamentally modern demands for the complete reconstitution of like everything that capitalism made possible. So yeah, so that's why.
Well, given that capitalism as a system is inherently racist, sexist, xenophobic, we could go on, what if if there is any sites of repair that we have to make it kind of possible to kind of exist under capitalism, or perhaps lead ourselves towards a state in which it maybe no longer exists. When I think about the works of, for example, a recent book by Olufemi Otayo's Reconsidering Reparations, where as a philosopher, he's kind of deeply engaging in reparations, not just as a buyout or a single payment, or the sense that X country should pay Y country for the enslavement of a certain group of people, but to really reimagine how we can think about it from a technological perspective, ideological, true redistribution of resources, and putting the climate crisis also front and center into that debate, especially as the kind of impact of the climate crisis isn't evenly felt between those in the global north versus those in the global south. And so I wonder to what extent maybe reparations, repair, or any kind of restitution features as a way to work through the debt that is incurred, what people are owed, and how we can get to a place of perhaps healing from these historical injustices. Sorry, big questions.
Okay. I think, no, you just remind me, you remind me of my intellectual age, which is, those of us who fought for the revolution and now cannot do it anymore. So it's like, what can we call it? What can we call it? No, but seriously, well, certain understandings or proposals for reparations, and I know that his are not of that kind. So some of them is just like, why? Yeah, definitely not the check. So I don't disavow any attempt at restoration, as long as it is contingent upon some other destruction taking place, so as to make something possible, right? So whatever they are, we have to always pay attention to what else is becoming impossible and what else has become possible. Both of them things that we may not want whenever some gesture is there. I remember in the 90s joking, like, every time they give us a right, well, just wait, there will be a reason to kill us coming. So you want to enjoy the ride. So, there is always these possibilities. But I am, I think, my focus, I should say, is on, because the folks, I'm more interested in thinking, and I'm more interested in thinking in different ways, and also in unthinking. So one of the things that motivate me is to think justice differently, whatever falls under the term justice differently. And for a while, I've been convinced that the only possible reformulation of justice that makes sense is decolonization. Both as, as a series of juridic economic shifts, transformations, and undoings that take place, but also decolonization as that which replaces what we call the horizon of justice. So, and I'll call it restoration of the total value expropriated from native lands and enslaved bodies. The restoration, the return, which is absolutely impossible, because this is part of this total value. So that impossibility as an obligation and the utter failure of meet that should guide any kind of attempt at restoration. But the only ones acceptable in the attempts are the ones that do not cause more harm, right? So, like, what is to me, yeah, is the principle. Now, how we do that then is that's the political work to be done, right? Because we have to do the work to demand that and then make sure it's not not, like the solutions for global warming, our electric cars and the lithium mines that are destroying, and the mining in Africa. So.
Yeah, and I guess part of also what we had talked a little bit about, and I guess I want your thoughts about this too, is so often, and when I'm thinking about the Black studies and specifically the different iterations of how people discuss not just literature and philosophy and speculation, but also what does it mean to engage with Afro-pessimism? Because in a way, one could say, if we follow the line of Frank Wilderson, there could be this possibility of we just have to destroy the world as we know it, and maybe it's the work of not necessarily philosophers to do that work necessarily, but to have those who are engaged in those social movements, as you said, those who might have been the descendants, who've been displaced, who've been somehow occupied, and figuring out that work collectively with the least amount of destruction can be possible. However, moving beyond that, I also wanted to kind of engage with the notion of joy and tenderness as a concept, and how we can, if at all, think about that as we also engage in the work of digging deep into debt, which is to say that there have been, at least in the past couple years, Black writers, theorists, such as Margot Jefferson in her latest book, The Nervous Conditions. Alice Walker has a memoir that she published last year on raising chickens and engaging with joy. And Ross Gay wrote this book called The Book of Delights, and trying to think actively about gratitude and delight as a Black person. And I mention these texts as a way to actively say, well, our history is more than our suffering. Our history is more than slavery and colonialism. There is an active history making that we're involved in, and even in the conditions of major financial wealth being extracted from a majority of the working class. And I wanted to know, to what extent can a philosopher like yourself offer space for joy and tenderness and delight as a kind of intellectual process, but also as an inquisitive way of moving through the world?
If I say no, you'll call me an Afro-pessimist, more even than Frank. Yeah, so I can't say no, because I don't want to be an Afro-pessimist. So, so I agree. I think, obviously, we, and I'm talking about the two of us, wouldn't be here if it was all about suffering, and if the different strategies for, if there weren't political strategies at different level that allowed for folks to, well, even the ones who survived the crossing, right, that moment, right? And then, of course, I'm sure that included care and tenderness, even if in the middle of, surrounded by all the instruments of total violence. So, yeah, I would never say, my answer would never be no, but what I'm interested really in is actually in how then we can, remember, recall, ask about such practices and implement them in the present as a way, as part of the struggle now. And in a way, I think the poetical readings and the sentence alone, we have so much fun. There is so much tenderness in that practice. I think that actually is something that is enacted, but it's again also enacted as a way, as part of the, this thing which is a struggle, isn't it? So yes, I think my answer was yes. I am not an Afro-pessimist after all.
So I'll try to hold you to that. But one thing also that kind of relates to how we started, and at least the reading that you gave, is yesterday the U.S. Supreme Court voted to overturn Roe versus Wade, which was the constitutional protection to protect abortion. And this has kind of caused a lot of people, especially on the left, to really feel shocked on the one hand, but also quite prepared for this because there was a leak about a month ago indicating that this would occur, and that's where the court was leading. And with some people, who've kind of commented on this, they've very much indicated, well, at the end of the day, the bodily autonomy that was of enslaved women was never present, and to an extent that, as Octavia Butler mentions, but also Angela Davis in Women, Race, and Class has written about, Dorothy Roberts and Killing the Black Body. Over and over again, people have been aware of, especially if we think about incarcerated people with wombs who also end up not being able to have full autonomy over what happens to their bodies. And I wanted to know, to what extent do you see, the kind of paragraph that you read at the beginning and Dana's experience within Kindred and the world that she enters when she enters into antebellum Maryland, and how that juxtaposes with this new world that we're entering into. Because when I was born, Roe versus Wade was in existence, and I was unfortunately born on unceded territory in Seminole territory, what is called the US in Florida, but now that's not the case. And so I wanted to get your insight as to how we can think about this judicial ruling with relation to the family, the bodily autonomy and reproduction in antebellum US.
Well, we'll have to do so much work in dealing with that one, isn't it? Because I think we took for granted so many things. And maybe I can start with what was taken for granted, because I think it's similar to voting rights, which the overthrowing was in 2015, 50 years later, and Roe almost 50 years later. I think I can talk about the specifics, but it brings me back to that formation to the image of the political subject, of the subject who has rights and bodily autonomy and privacy and bodily integrity. That subject is the one that figures in all of those decisions, both in the decisions in themselves, but also in that which renders those decisions possible. And I'm both of them, the voting rights decision and now the Roe decision. And in saying that, I am, because that takes me to my critical legal life, I am a total pessimist, because I don't think that subject can ever fully provide to women, cis or trans women, and BIPOC people, and anyone that doesn't fit in the cis-hetero patriarchal image, in that image. It cannot provide anything that may be similar to that which we call rights, right? And why can't it provide any of that? Because any attention to anything that is not abstract, doesn't fit that form, is seen as a deviation to everything that supports our juridical structure. And any of those gains, including Roe, had always to come with some decision from the state, right? From the authority, which also in the liberal fable that is the US is precisely the reason why they exist. So we got to figure out how to do this, because they are taking the rights away because those rights were made for being taken away whenever there was a political force. Trump gave them the minimum political force they needed, and also put them in the positions to make those decisions. So what are we going to do, right? So, and I'm not, so basically what I'm trying to say, and I think Spiller says it beautifully, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, is that there is we make those claims within structures and according to a grammar that has always already been framed and positioned, and it operates against the very claims. Our claims make no sense. They are nonsense from that perspective. So we have options, right? We adjust the claims to make sense and get nothing, stay without those rights, even the minimum protections against being killed by the police, which are basic liberal protections, or we start figuring out some other way of living within those structures, but not only according to their rules and not only depending on them, right? So I'm sure that is what's going to happen in the same way that it's been happening, because, yeah, I don't know. So we are going to go back and fight for this right that was never really there for everyone, but we have to have it because you have to at least be able to access something, but then at the same time create some autonomous abortion clinics and make sure women don't die, right? Which is, in a way, which is weird, but makes so much sense once we realize that these structures are really made for failing us. I remember growing up and having, oh God, I forgot the name. These women who, oh my God, I forgot the name. Midwives, right? Midwives who did abortion. They were midwives, but they're also doing abortions in the economically dispossessed Black neighborhoods, right? The right wasn't there. We didn't have access to the hospital, but you had women who were very well trained to do that. So I don't know. I have no idea. I think we're in a bad situation because they will take each and every one of those rights away now. I thought they would not. I really thought that the leaking would actually give us the chance of doing something, but no. Yeah, nobody believed it, so here we are. Well, I don't know what's next. What's next?
Well, yeah, I would agree that the leaking for this and that particular right was one of many things that have been taken away from people, including the Voting Rights Act and what does it mean to really engage in any kind of democratic process, or for a country that claims often when it decides to occupy other people, other countries, that it's saving young girls and women, but then indeed creates policies that make it difficult for transgender kids, people with wombs, et cetera, to control their bodies. But as I know that time is coming to an end soon because we have to move to the next section, but one thing I wanted to ask you about is just the way or the role that collectivity has in shaping Black feminist thought. One of the things that has been quite influential for me, and I revisit this text all the time, is the Combahee River Collective's statement. And I revisit it in different versions, and I'm realizing different versions of myself see different aspects of that statement, and there are younger versions of myself that really focused on the Marxist element, other sections that focused on the fact that they needed to create this kind of body of in this community because they were being rejected from white feminist groups and Black nationalist groups and so forth, but yet they still found a way, not just as a kind of political force, but also intellectually, to come together to say that there is a necessity for us to not just think about us as individuals, but as a collective, as people who are theorists and people who, even if being ignored by a broader, country and various political movements, have the ability to kind of reshape the political, anti-capitalist, feminist landscape. And to an extent, there are versions of that still exist today, and versions of that also find a space in artistic elements, academic spaces, and also working class communities. And I guess I wanted to end with a question that speaks to the the ways in which you engage with collectivity and see collectivity as a praxis that is essential or part of dealing with the unpayable debt.
Yes. Yes, and I think we had an amazing meeting today with something that became a collective with other collectives, and I saw it's like, wow, we did here, like the collective that we talked here are like the ones in Brazil right now, and I know in the US too, and they are there not as a plan but as a practice, and it's not, I think, by accident that most of them are formed by cis and trans women, not many guys involved in the kind of work, and it's not by accident that they are looking at all aspects of our lives, and they are also not by accident that many of them are artists too, like there is no difference, there is no differentiation. And I think this is already a response, a political response to the political situation in which even the few rights that were made there available, either you never have access to them, either there is something that collapses them, like police brutality or an economic crisis and the adjustments that come with that, or they are taken away. So I think we are already doing something. I don't know what it is. But I think we can see it proliferating in the form of collectives. And yeah, it's a response. Now, what will come out of it? I don't know. It depends on how we engage. I think we should pay attention now, pay more attention to it and explore the potentials of those collectives because, yeah, the state, it's the only thing that has guaranteed any of the rights made on the basis of any of the social categories, right? There is always at the end in the US, for instance, some compelling state interest, quote unquote. And if we are not Leninists anymore, right? We don't believe in that, so I don't know what we can do. I think we can do. I mean, I don't know what we can do in that level. There is nothing more to do in that level. I think it's more about how the kinds of collectives we come up with and how we do it. I don't know.
So thank you so much for engaging in such a rich conversation. I would like to have the audience join me in congratulating you.
Thank you for the questions. Very nice.
Thank you both for these very important questions to tackle on. I have one specific question to both of you, and I would like to open then to one final question. Please don't get into a fight. For the final question, you will have time to have interactions with Edna and Denise today. But we came together here in a framework of science mostly just now, and both of you have been engaging personally and structurally on these problematics of institutions of knowledge that have been built upon the superstructure of capitalism and division. And I just think about when you mentioned the Supreme Court, how in the past weeks I was following the nomination of Judge Brown Jackson and how she has gone through very cynical questions and questions that are not even her department, as education or biology, how she understands women, how actually this reflects the American liberalism, Republicans, how they don't want to confront the fact that America, as it has been called, was built upon devastation, killings, mass murder. And I was thinking about the curriculum as such, and how you, for instance, Edna Bonhomme, through one of your podcasts and further constellations of students that I've been in touch with, got me through the problematics here in Berlin, in which you have been engaging, for instance, a department that is supposed to be for African studies, but it came from the time of ethnological practices, and how you have been thinking how to bring this up into a platform to really understand that knowledge here is not necessarily being expressed and being lived in a way that we really talk about what happens, that the people who know, who go through these lives, that would then also enable black people, people of African descent. So I wonder what is this showing to you today, because there have been some groups now emerging that in my time when I was studying at Free University that I think it was the only black at the Department of Philosophy, and I wonder what it shows to you in your interactions with Denise, what you're thinking of, maybe opening up more here.
So as a historian of science and as someone who currently lives in Germany, I have found that it is my obligation to learn about the history of violence that this country has done, not just on the territory of German-speaking lands in Europe, but also on the African continent and beyond, and to really do that investigative work from a place of, thinking about those who've been oppressed. And so, for example, in my current book project, I have an entire chapter on Robert Koch, the microbiologist who, when I learned about him through the postulates, and specifically the ways in which we can understand bacteria and contagion is through his postulates. However, living here in Germany and understanding his role and his presence in Egypt and the Pacific Islands, but specifically in East Africa, I did the work and have been doing the work to see how he was also part of creating and constructing medical concentration camps in East Africa and beyond as a way to cure sleeping sickness. And the reason this matters to bring it up is, yes, we've been discussing the US. I happen to be born in that context, and I'm also of Haitian descent and a descendant of slaves. But I think it's also my duty and my obligation to move beyond the place that I'm from and to think on these international levels and see how the arteries of colonial and violence and enslavement are also happening here and continue to happen as we think about the memories of someone like Robert Koch. And that's just one example of many examples. And if we are to do the work of decolonization, and I'm so happy that you brought that up, and to really think deeply about it, part of that also is just learning a history that I was never taught, and then unlearning the kind of colonial internalized, misconceptions that you learn across the Atlantic about this part of the world. And so, yeah, I think it's a kind of work in progress. And as a historian, the archive can be a site of violence that will show and reveal how these structural policies were enacted, but it could also be the tool to find the evidence so that I can unpack in a more meaningful way what we could have done better and how we can actually undo and decolonize ourselves. So I'll stop there, but if you want to elaborate.
No, I'm just going to say something else. You have provided a very perfect answer. So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to say something else, which is kind of yes. And then, but I'm thinking that in addition to, talking about changing curricular changes, I think in addition to any curricular change that we may make in order to make it less or something or more something, I'm not going to name it, because we are talking about institutions again, the family, slavery, and then educational institutions. They also have this way of doing the thing that they do, right? So I think it's also important to create some subversive ways, like to subvert the whole thing from within. So if we can do it in the curriculum, in the curricula, in all of them, probably okay, but that is not, we have, at least in Canada, the US, and the UK, have a whole process of approval that makes it impossible. So I think it will be more at level of practice. And in the ways I think that, Fred Moten is always talking about improvisation, and every time I have a conversation with him about improvisation, I understand the potential of improvisation, and I think that's kind of like what the subversion will be through that, and not in the institutionalization of something, whatever it is, because it's never going to be, right? Never going to be.
So now I didn't hear any movement starting about the last question. Who would like to pose it? Does everyone agree? No, please go ahead.
Hello. I'm Krista, and I'm doing a PhD here in Berlin and about labor and capitalism, and my work is about slavery in Brazil, and actually the whole historiography and social science about slavery and its relation with capitalism. And I'm wondering, in that sense, like if we're thinking about like what to do, and we are talking about racialized capitalism, and in that sense that racialized capitalism is not another kind of capitalism. This is the capitalism since the beginning. And in your work, you also talk a lot about labor and the expropriated and exploited labor. And I think, this is exactly my point, and this what interests me in that sense, like this expropriation of certain groups, and they are continuing being brown and black people, like until nowadays in different forms. This expropriation reproduces itself. And I think that, as I'm a Marxist as well, then I think that there is the history, the critical way of the heterodox way of Marxism is that that slavery showed the slavery of the wage labor, which the wage always, the wage kind of mystified the exploitation or the expropriation of the wage labor, and it continues until today. So that's what I'm wondering, if we're thinking about another project and another society, which I think that liberation and emancipation and equality and justice in capitalism, which is racialist, is impossible, because the different forms of exploiting labor. And I think still it's fundamental. Where does the capital accumulate itself? Based on what? Based on whose parties? Based on whose mind? So can we still think about internationalist proletariat, which combines, which unites the expropriated black bodies with the white exploited Europeans, for example, or North Americans?
Yes, but also we will need some other changes, right? Lots of adjustments in that. So in addition to, finally realizing that capitalism lives off expropriation of land and bodies, we might have to collapse, like Marx's economic moments, consumption, production, circulation, whatever, and then he kind of like says they are different and it's a circle thing. But we may have to collapse them in a way. And as consumers, insofar as we exist and are made possible because of accumulated capital, the conditions of our lives, including our bodies, like whether it is in the machine or in other ways. So we have to rethink that too, right? So it's not only, because it's not, this is like a question for the beginning of the conversation, so I can't do it now because too much. But yes, so I'll say that. So in addition to acknowledging that capitalism lives off of that, we also have to make the acknowledgement that we are also embodied capital in a way, right? And we live off that because we are made out of it. And everything that is in the conditions of our lives is the embodiment, the materialization, the actualization of that expropriation and exploitation. And then we pergunto, what you gonna do if that's the case? How do we begin to think about any kind of transformation or bringing about anything that we may think falls under, justice? Or would liberty and equality be enough, right? Would they allow for even thinking? I mean, would they make sense if that's how we think? So those questions, right? So it will probably take us way beyond not only heterodox Marxism, would take us somewhere else, while it should be engaged in a critique of global capital in its present configuration, and also hopefully attending to global warming and this damn thing that is happening, in which we are all involved and not doing much about, and finding solutions that just reproduce expropriation and extraction and everything. So that's how I think about it. It's right here. It's living differently right here, right now. It's not going anywhere. There is nowhere to go. That's it, right? Because, if we think about going somewhere else, we're still in the same logic. I think that's what we are confronted with, and that's what makes it so difficult. Number one, the planet, the thing that we take for granted, can't take it for granted, right, anymore. And number two, there is no place to go. Unless we come and, get into some fantasy like Musk and those guys of other colonial fantasies of extraction somewhere else, it's like we can't do it again. So we're stuck here. We're here. This is it. There is nothing else. So how do we do it? What stuff, right?
And yet the work opens up for the space of imagination of the non-tangible, and this would lead us to the film that you have realized. Downstairs will be the place in which we will immerse ourselves into, I think, 37 minutes film. It was realized in 2020. There will be a short introduction about how this film has been realized as you as a co-director. And I would like to kind of wrap up the setup here by saying this is one that is limited, but also opening up actually to so many of the engagements that Denise Ferreira da Silva and you, Edna Bonhomme, have been realizing. So thank you everyone for this time now, that we are now continuing as continuous being. We have drinks and food upon some donation for continuation of this space, and many to come that will arrive in a bit. And then we go downstairs to immerse in the film, and there will be conversations in the digital space and coming up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
So, good evening. I am Bonaventure Sobeyang Dikung, and I was told a few minutes ago to say something. So I'm doing that, and it's going to be a brief introduction. It's been a very long day, and I think the introduction will just be a shout out. And because we do believe in the politics of shout out, as my colleague Amal Al-Haq would say. And a shout out to all the people that have been here all day long, participating in the workshops, participating in the conversations with Denise, co-authoring the films, and now in the conversation. I know Olivier is rushing, but I just wanted to mention massive thanks to Céline Barry, to Edna Bonhomme, obviously to Denise Ferreira da Silva, Olivier Mabeuf, Alette Louise Ndakoze, Juna Neumann, Lucy Nganga, and all the people that have been organizing this in the background, Cordula, Anna, and all the rest of the teams. that made this, Raisa, Galofre, and all the others that made this possible. So thank you all. So that was the shout out. Then, you know, Olivier and Ajuna, they don't need an introduction at Savvy, but we'll do so because it's important to do that. And I'll read that out. But Olivier has been a collaborator, somebody who runs a sister institution in Paris for many years, and somebody who we've worked for several years doing different projects. And it's always a pleasure to have him with us. And Olivier Mabouf is a writer, storyteller, curator. And together with Yvan Alakbe, he founded the independent art space Chiasma, Espace Chiasma, which ran from 2004 to 2018 in Paris, Le Lila. And for some, it ended in 2018. For us, we know that it just mutated into other forms. It's become even more urgent and even wilder in its activities, more subversive, and it is present with us. The program he developed there addressed minority representations and post-colonial situations through exhibitions, screenings, debates, performances, and much more. He's interested in different modalities of knowledge transmission and imagines permanent ephemeral structures based on conversations, speculative narratives, and his works intersect with poetic fiction and speculative theories. I'll leave it at that, Olivier, if it's okay, because if I wanted to continue reading, it could be all night. So we'll leave it at that.
I think it's fine.
Ajuna Neumann, who co-authored the film we just saw, and I think it's important to do this, and we all know that you're tired, but you cannot watch a film like the one we just watched without having a deep conversation about it. So that's what we're going to do now. Ajuna is an artist, writer, filmmaker currently based in Berlin. He just flew in today. From where? From London. Okay, it's not so far away. It's okay, you're excused. He works with the essay form as a multi-perspectival and experimental approach in which he explores the economic, social, and ideological systems that shape our lived experiences. Essay for him is a future-oriented mode of research and production, shifting between the bodily and affective through the geopolitical, planetary, and cosmological. And he's done a whole lot of work, many films, been presented in many biennials, and he's been at Savvy several times. And that's a good thing. So I'll pass it over to you guys. You already know Denise, so I don't need to introduce her. But Denise, thank you very much for this day, for blessing us with your presence, with your knowledge, for taking the time, you know, an investment of a day. And I think that was also part of the shout out. So thank you for that, and looking forward to the conversation. Okay, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Do you hear me? Yeah, it seems you hear me. Yeah, I got a delay in my headphone, which is difficult to speak. Okay, bon. Hello everybody, good evening. Hello Arjuna, hello Denise. Yeah, so yeah, I will cut a bit the sound not to have the echo. And so yeah, I'm very sorry, but I'm staying at the moment on the other side of the ocean. So Denise, our routes crossed indeed, and I'm staying in Miami for the Third Horizon Film Festival for a very important conversation. Supposed to give a kind of keynotes. So, because we're a bit delayed, gonna be unfortunately short on my side, and it's really a pity because, of course, it's a pleasure to talk with you two about your common practices. I would like, I note 5 different short speculation about the film, but I'm not sure I will have time enough. So I will begin with a very simple question addressed to Denise. Considering that today there is different aspect of what you are doing and what you are working on, which are explore, I would like to, because I never asked you directly that question, I would like to you to say something about your relation with the artistic practice beside other things you are doing. What is the statute, for instance, of the filmmaking with Arjuna, beside, your other practice of research, thinking, speculation, and activism?
Okay, hi everybody again. Thank you so much, Olivier, for staying up and being part of this. Oh no, it's earlier for you actually. I don't even know. And I'd like to thank everybody, especially the folks at Beyond the Liberal Scripts, like Jeanette and Cordula and Christian for making this happening, and of course Savi. I think it's always important to repeat that, and everybody here at Savi. And also I'd like to thank you again and Arjuna for playing, continuing this play. So Olivier, your question is what is my relation to the artistic practices? Is that, if I understand it correctly? It is so it is something that I kind of, I like to say that people made invitations and came up with ideas, and I said yes, and then I found myself living a double life or a triple life. And it started with a collaboration with Rosalind Martin, who is a Black British feminist activist playwright, and we collaborated on a play, The Return of the Vanishing Peasant. And as we were doing that, I realized and I learned it was a very difficult process, because to me it was a matter of translation of things, but I realized several things. One of them was that what came out of that collaboration was something that had to do with me, but also with Rosalind, and that for the academic in me just felt like, okay, there is another way of doing something out there in the world with others that doesn't resolve into the academic, the academic practice of the author and single author, etc. So, and then Roz, and then the collaboration with Valentina, and then the collaboration with Arjuna, which, like the collaboration with Roz, and the thing, because it was theater, there was another element that when I went to see the play, we got that award, and there was the play, and then I didn't know how to feel about it, because there was a director, there were the producers, there was the actor was a one actor, and then I also realized that everything was coming out of that collaboration, and I could just sit there and be somebody as part of a collective, and I think that's what maybe that's the main thing that comes out in the artistic practice as as a question that to which I answer as an I. What that changes in terms of, in regard to all the elements that enter there, which is the research and the conceptualization, everything is the same as the academic practice, but there is something in the work that it becomes something else. It's always that film, it's us, right? And it's us, sometimes it's us separate, sometimes it's us together. But then in all of them also, to me, like comes the pieces of my life, and the other person's life. With Roz in the play, we had, some of it was about her family in Santa Lucia, some of it was about my family. And in this film, we have, Arjuna's mom there, and we have these images from Manaus and the Amazon and Brumadinho. And my mother is from Minas, her family is from Minas. So there is also this coming together of things, and it becomes something else. And I like it that I can watch the film and be affected by it without being, it's not, it's not me, it's there. It's weird. I don't know what else to say about it, but that's how I can describe it in comparison to the academic to the academic work. And in particular with Arjuna, we also have this thing that we just go like out of our minds together, and it's so much fun. So we have so much fun.
Yeah.
I get out of my mind, literally.
Yeah, thank you. Because I don't have a lot of time, I just go through the five small inputs I was aiming to share with you without being able to develop all, but just to tell you opening that it could be. The first one was really a non-representation. As we know that, let's say the classical documentary cinema and also part of the artistic cinema with socio-political ambitions on the West are often based on scene of representation that for me are indeed scene of crimes or scene of police in the sense of Jacques Rancière, scene where minorities and non-Western life are asked to testify, scene of representation that are scene of capture and assignation. And I do think you both try to escape from it. So my first question, and I just will share with you, is a film could be a way of non-representation. So of course, it's related to the notion of non-performance that have been developed also by Fred Merton. But you feel in that remarks a kind of contradiction of what cinema is considered to be and why it's also partly problematic as an apparatus coming from the colonial legacy and how try to do something to dismantle that very heavy legacy. I just go through just other points quickly, and just I will let you respond. The second point is something that I saw in a lot of your films. Is really that question of scale and distance as a question of responsibility, in the sense of the Nahaway, the responsibility created by a scale. And I was noting, watching that new film and thinking about the previous one, about the idea indeed of the capacity to stay in a certain distance to things, to stay in on the scene of crime, on the risk and close to the risk of certain life or certain situation or not. And in a certain way, I do feel that with that last film, that there is indeed a certain series of scale, position, and proximity, and that let open some missing distance in a way. In a sense of the film is not closing all the possibilities, but letting the possibility of insisting on acting through, for instance, through a critical conversation and collective conversation, adding all the position in. So again, I will call it a way of of creating a space for what it can represent. So our film could be not a representation of something, but a way of space making for what it can't represent. That is, again, for me, another very interesting proposal. And I will go really quickly for the to two last points. There is really that notion of unnameable, untranslatable, unrepresentable. And I just note, watching the film, Love and Monstrosity, called Terra Preta. I'm very interested in the Terra Preta indeed. It's not the first time I heard about that very specific anthropogenic soil, which is a kind of anti-dystopia in a way to of the presence of the human being on the planet Earth. If we consider that we're just there to destroy anything, that is the kind of dystopia that we often have to fight against. We don't have a lot of evidence that help us to think about us as the humanity of out of the toxic uh, collectivity of existence. But the Terra Preta is a very interesting hypothesis, and I would like to position it in a certain point of representation. I would like to consider that the Terra Preta is not only an object to be represented, but it's by itself a representation of another kind of an expanded idea of cinema. meaning that cinema out of the scene of representation of the Western epistemology can have other kind of forms, other kind of possibility. And I do feel that the Therapeutta is a representation by itself of a potentiality that we have to. And so I'm very interested in the tension in between the life and the image of life. It's the last element I would like to address to you. How we deal with the image of life to produce a kind of desire towards the living, because the extraction of image can be considered as a practice of destruction, and our image of life can produce desire for life, which is for the image of Therapeutta. For me, I have to produce the idea of something is not representable, but is represented by the Therapeutta itself, which is echoing for me of the Horton Spieler reflection about really the paradigm of the slave as a matter, as a negativity. But indeed, at the end, after all the path through the death and over the death, there is a new form of living, a detour towards a living. And so for me, the Therapeutta is a kind of representation of a detour. That's what I aim to share with you.
Thank you so much, Olivier. I'll let Juni is going to.
Put on the spot. It's really great to hear your comments, Olivier. I've forgotten some of them, but I think the try now? Yep, sorry. The non-representable is something that we've been developing and discussing since the beginning of our collaboration, starting with an attempt to film Denise and finding that problematic or just not working. In SOOTH, Breath, Corpus, Infinitum, you see the opening shots from Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and there's a kind of speculation here about what would Hiroshima, Mon Amour be if it never went beyond the opening scene. I mean, the rest of the film, we all know, descent or devolves into identity, and it's the identity that, or representation, or national, I don't know, East and West, all of those kind of problems of identity is what pulls apart the love. But there's a speculation there of what if we stayed with just the opening scene? What if that was the beginning and end of that movie? I'll talk to Therapeutta because Denise has been talking all day, and this idea of Therapeutta as cinema is really beautifully put. I think we were thinking a little bit about like film grain and how film grain is measured in luminance, and soot has one of the least, or zero luminance, one of the least reflective of light. So we were speculating with the idea of soot as film grain. Well, what happens if you unleash the grain from the celluloid? And we have shots of Kodak in Manaus. What if you unleash the grain and create a kind of a planetary cinema, a cinema made of soot? And so Therapeutta, which is like primarily constituted by carbon and soot and charcoal, would be a kind of formation of this soot cinema, sooty cinema.
I'm just going to add something about, so it's not, doesn't sound like making original answer to the questions. No, but about the non-representational, and I just want to mention it in terms of, in the context of our collaboration, because like Serpent Rain, the whole argument in there was against time, right? And the elements. And the way the film came out, it shows the tension of taking is a form that is about duration, and we want to do a film against duration. And I think this against that context, assumed context for representation, and I think it comes back in the other films. In a way, it's a recurrent theme. We lost him. In a way, it's a recurrent. It's not so much a theme, it's in the making of it. It is more in when we have the conversations about how to do something, and then in the film comes out as always the failure of doing what we wish we could do, but that's that. And I think that's why I don't know. I mean, we had conversations about this film that we both feel like crying at some point in the film. I think that's what the film does. The films do to us.
I think so. I think Olivier has asked us this question, or gave us feedback about this right from the beginning, about a kind of, classic documentary has a figure, has maybe a narrative, maybe even a script, and this is something we've thought about a lot. And I think in this film, we tried to really have an emotional experience, have cry, have tenderness, have intimacy, but to try and do that without having a narrative, without identifying with the lead character, without having these kind of traditions of narrative cinema, also traditions of documentary. And documentary is increasingly become, like My Friend the Octopus or something, is increasingly becoming more like narrative film. So yeah, how to hold on to an emotional, affective, more of an embodied experience, like crying as an embodied reaction than an emotional experience. How to hold on to that, but let go of, representation, identification, all of these kind of aspects of subjectivity that we, are violent and have problems with.
And I think in that watching the film in the big screen for the first time, but watching it after so many times, it made me think also about what it's there in terms of the political, whatever, if it is an intervention, right? I think that is something that about sensibility and the reorientation of sensibility. So before having all kinds of, conceptual arguments and developing methods or strategies for a critique of subjectivity, that is sensibility, and there is no talking about it, right? There is no, I think that's, it's visual and it's sound, but still it is what we do ends up being about.
Yeah, I think we dedicated at the beginning to tenderness and to the blues, and this is a kind of, it can be an emotion, but it's like at the threshold of an emotion and an embodied experience. It's at the threshold of the human and the non-human, or the non-living. It's one of those states which, it's a threshold state, and yeah, I think it's a sensibility that we go after.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask you my last question because my taxi is there indeed. Just knocking the door, as I said. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, the last point, I think it's a question that I share also with the audience, and we can develop it. Is really the question that is coming also through the legacy of the Afro-pessimism reflection. It's about the representation of violence. And so if we consider that there is not only human violence, but also non-human violence, what about representing a landscape of violence with HD images? What is the tension in that? I think I was totally with you about switching to non-human representation, but so it raises a question of representation of a landscape of violence, landscape of extraction, whose are sort of bodies that we have to care about. And so I've been emotionally really touched by the landscape of extraction in Brazil, for instance, as a kind of tension that I thought with also the scene of hallucination and in Indonesia at the beginning. I connect to both situations. And I was trying to say how to deal with that, because we have to share some images and how to deal with the violence of the new consideration of the expanding notion of violence and violence on so-called landscapes. I will let you with that question because I will have to later because the guy's gonna kill me. But thank you very much and have a good evening. Ciao, ciao.
What's non-human violence?
What is?
Non-human violence. So he was mentioned.
I don't know, but we can talk about violence in the film, right?
I think one of the earlier questions that Olivia brought up was this question of scale and how to move across these different scales, from the soil right through to these landscapes, these mining, extraction landscapes. And I think you can do that when you start to let go of things like representation, when you let go of, a human-centered narrative, and you start to focus on matter, on the elements or on soot.
Yeah, but okay, I'm going to just, reply to Olivier's question about violence in a more general way, because it is something from Serpent Rain we have been dealing with that, right? How I remember our question with the Serpent Rain, it's like, okay, so we were focusing on the revolt against police brutality and the burning and the fires. But then how to comment on it and its relevance and make the connection between police brutality and slavery and capital and extraction. We do that too, without showing the scene of violence. And I think, and then we had the same thing with Four Waters and the scenes on the boats, right? How much of those scenes do you want to show as we indicate that the film? And here we have the same thing. And I think the way we resolved it, which is a resolution because it is part of our negotiation, because I know from my side, it's like, I don't want to show those scenes, but then this is a film, and there's, and then, how do you do that? That is not much. I can write many papers, but the film will have the scene. But I think in the different films, we have dealt with that reference differently, and in this one, and maybe that's why this one touches more. I think we dealt with the reference in a way that also brought the film also exposed the film's participation in that. So when the crystal becomes a film at the end, and all those scenes of violence come back, including Margaret Mead's scene of violence, because that was, what it is. I think that's how we decided, like, okay, so there is no way out. If you start doing this, so if you go for it, then you will bring that violence back with you, and then in the process of trying to work through and address its conditions of possibility, but it comes back. And not bringing it back is also betrayal, because then you can put yourself in a position of purity as if you are not implicated in it anyway. So that's what we did, right? I mean, we are implicated in it, even as we come from, your family from the persecutions of Chinese Indonesians back then, and my family from this tradition of slavery in Brazil and extraction in Minas Gerais, but we are also implicated in it from here. And so the question is then, what do you do with that? But it's always going to be there. But I think it is horrible, but it's a good thing, because it also takes away from us any pretension. Right.
Yeah, of being outside of it or above it, or I think, including the Margaret Mead images and including images of celluloid and Kodak, and that is one sort of, to own up to your, participation in the violence. But also, listening to the blues. And a lot of the blues songs is extremely violent, extremely brutal, and yet, at the same time, those songs were designed to be danced to, designed for joy, for closeness. So there's a contradiction between some of the dark violence in the lyrics, and then this kind of danceable tempo, and sort of also the improvisation part of it.
And I will just say this and let you folks say what you want, but now I missed it. I missed the conversation with Fred and Stefano, but I watched their lecture, right? And their lecture is about both the distinction between violence and brutality, and at the same time, the indistinction between care, love, and violence. And it's just a beginning of a conversation with them about it, but I feel like we are already in the middle of that conversation. And then if that is so, right, if violence and love and care are descriptors that, you know, are possible descriptors for any different kinds of moments, right, a touch may become a slap at any point, then what we do with our investments and our options, and yeah, anyway.
I guess the blues is, the name comes from a bruise, you know. And that's where, you know, you can also find tenderness in the bruise. Should we open up to?
Yes. More drinking.
On the topic of violence and how you're dealing with it, I don't know if I was reading too much into the film, because now you're talking about this, you know, like care, violence, tenderness, everything, and I was thinking about time and how you use time, you know, that it begins as it ends. But also that the moments of violence are in reverse. So you have the scenes, so like the crates coming from the carriage, and then and then something else. So I was thinking of that as like what do you call it? I only have an African word. But like a cast, like casting, like reversing, but symbolically, obviously, and performatively, obviously, not that the violence will be erased, but the act of really deciding to put the film in those moments as a way of healing in some way or another. I don't know if I was like going too far into it. Okay.
Totally. I think like what Olivia was saying about the terra preta being this kind of representation or non-representation of a people from before, and how that's the waste product of like ancient societies that is left over, that becomes some of the most fertile soils. So yeah, this sort of playing with time, or, you know, getting rid of time altogether as much as possible.
An understanding of time that is not listed. I think that's what I'm getting at. Because we don't see time as linear.
That's a decision we made, that in Four Waters, we had something still sequential, that at some point when we were in Haiti, Earth, then there was going to be a shift. And then for the SOOTH breath, it happens every segment. It happens again. So you totally nailed it, yeah.
For me, I think it's so beautiful to see the intimacy in other perspective, because sometimes the narrative official put the ideas for us. The intimacy is about sex, is about love, is about stay together. And the voices of Hortensia Spillers, she told about intimacy. I am crying because I felt when Yes, one emotion of this time we live now, because we close it all the time. The moment we stay together is so difficult because we have the prosthesis, cell phone. The moment we stay in the presence of the person is difficult for stay together. The questions, the conversation, everything. And the moment she told about this intimacy, and I understand the possibility of life in the other affective. That's all.
Yeah, you don't need any comments, but yes. I just want to say yes.
As I was watching the film, I think one of the scenes where you have, it was like the land where you have the mining, and you have all of those trucks. Suddenly I remembered something when I was I don't know how old I was, I think I was 11 or 12. And we did a school trip, went to the gold mines in Namibia, and I remember stopping with the bus right on the top and looking down into this like excavated land. And I remember I couldn't stand, we had to climb out of the bus and stand on the piece at the top, on one of the mounds. And I remember having this headache, and I felt like I was going to fall down and roll right down into the bottom of this big pit. And I remember having never felt that feeling before, and I actually had to be escorted back, and I had to go sit back into the bus because I couldn't stand in that mining area. So that reminded me of that day. Yeah, and I just thought about that. And I also really loved your idea of calling the echo a her, and this idea of this compositions, you being part of your own composition and connecting with compositions of some other things somewhere else. And I thought that, was a thread that went throughout your film, whether it was the music or whether it was the scenes or the imagery, and yeah, thanks.
No, yeah, again, yes, thank you.
One thing to say about the mining was, we were thinking about how, I think Brazil is the second largest exporter of steel, and how the Mexico-American-US border wall is being built with Brazilian steel, or in parts being built with Brazilian steel.
And yet, right, it's Brazil, but it's Namibia then, and it's DRC now, and it's Chile now, and Canada on indigenous lands, and the US on indigenous lands. So that every awareness of extraction, that was the trigger for the film, right? I was home in Vancouver, and my parents were in Vancouver too, and we were watching the news in Brazil, because when my parents are around, we are in Brazil, so I do like all kinds of ways of watching the news in Brazil. And then that happened, the collapse of that dam in Brumadinho happened. And then, right, and I said, Arjuna, we've got to do something about Earth, and it's going to be about extraction, and this shit is like, gotta do something about it. But it's, of course, what mobilized me again was not only that unique event, but the fact that it happened again. They had killed the river in Brazil like 2 years earlier, and then they were killing rivers, and again, the same company. And then again, remembering that it's been going on for so many years, and in Africa, in the Americas, and yeah. So that's the thing about the sensibility, right? Because I think we know that it is the case, but there is something else that happens when you feel that it is the case. And that's where, answering Olivia's first question, I think art is, interests me in that because that cannot, you can't write a book about that. There is no book that will do that. Convince people they should feel differently. There is no way.
This feeling you had, it sounds a little bit like vertigo or something, you know, a very embodied, like fully, you know, you had to be carried back or something, you know, your legs went weak. And been thinking a little bit about these films as kind of a body horror films. You know, the body horror tries to go after like high sensation, but not human bodies, but like planetary body. Like what would a planetary body horror film be? And maybe to think, about horror in place of pessimism.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the film with us. And I will be interested in knowing more about the title of the film, Future Perfect, because it sounds a bit like a temporality or a praxis, like an action, like this time. So I was curious to know better how you decided for this title.
Actually, Future Perfect is the name of the event, and the film title is Soot Breath, Corpus Infinitum.
Okay, now makes because when you started the film, I could not find exactly what. Could you repeat again?
It's Soot Breath / Corpus Infinitum.
Okay, so now could you also talk more about this correct title of the film? Because I was also asking myself about the title because I could not see the beginning of the film, and now I saw there, I thought this was the title, but yes, thank you for the explanation.
Sure. They both sort of mean the same thing, kind of in our different languages or in our different ways. Soot Breath was the name of a conference we organized, I think, in 2019. And it kind of gets at this like planetary body horror, soot as a celluloid, soot in place of film grain. It's not a precise specific title. It's something that is constantly opening and reforming and recomposing. And I think...
And yes, and then Corpus Infinitum is a reference to echo, right? And it is this, because the film, the element is inspiring the film is earth, hence also soot, right? The transformation from solid through gas. No, what's that? Deposition.
Gas to solid.
Gas to solid. Yeah. We're getting our phase transitions. It's like too much to remember. So that's the elemental commentary in the film, the soot breath. But then there is this more, I would say, like in terms of the image of, you know, everything we are describing, then Corpus Infinitum would correspond to that. So in the movement from from soot to the bodies, right, you see it happening, and the other movements that go from solid to solid in a different way in the film. So it is this body, it is a body without limits, it's a body without determination, it's a body outside of space-time. It is a different figuring of body, right? Because body is so much the thing of space-time, so that's what we're playing with.
We're working on the next one. We are doing one film for each classical element. So this one is based around earth, four waters is water. We're working on wind right now, and we're saving fire till the last one.
What?
Saving fire for the end.
I know, because that's how
that's,
we do it.
yeah.
The signs of fire, we're going to burn this shit down. Anyway, so... Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So that was the first round. we will be continuing sometime, maybe not tomorrow, but sometime soon, hopefully. Okay. Thank you so much, Denise, for the time. Thank you, Juni. And thank you all for coming. To be honest, it was such a beautiful day outside. I don't know why you guys came. You know, you could have been somewhere else, but you decided to come here, and we really appreciate that, you know, so we're very thankful for that. Also, lots of gratitude to the Excellence Cluster Script for this beautiful collaboration, for bringing all of us together. And thanks to the spaceship that is Savvy Contemporary for hosting us today. And what? Oh, thank you. Yeah, bro. Oh, very good. So we thank she who did the wonderful food. It was beignet haricot. And I saw some granite soup and some other stuff. I hope you guys are belly full, as we say. So, you know, because it's part of Savvy. You don't come to Savvy without eating, man. Yeah, that's it. But it's good. Thank you for reminding me of that. You know, it's part of the art. So when all is said and done, when you've gone and enjoyed the sun and gone to some swimming, you come back to Savvy and look at the exhibition. And then we need to sit and talk. There's a lot happening. The past weeks have been very, very difficult for all of us. We need to sit down and strategize. It's not going to happen par hasard. We need to structure ourselves. The forces that are against us are much stronger than we can imagine. And they don't take things lightly. They sit down and plot. While we talk and we watch the beautiful and poetic films, we must sit down and strategize. It's a long battle. We have to be prepared for that. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We have to know that. So go get some rest, and we'll reconvene in the next days to strategize and continue working. Thank you.